Welcome everybody to the first episode of the Armchair QB. What a great week 0 it was. Best week 0 we've had in the past several years since week 0 was created. Georgia Tech pulls off the major upset. Montana State survives. SMU pulls off a close one against Nevada. And it's just setting up for what's going to be a great season, starting with week 1. But before we get into week 1, we've got to do conference breakdowns and then playoff predictions. And that's going to start with this episode with the ACC. It's a little bit late, and we've already seen a major shakeup in the ACC race. But it's going to be an ACC breakdown. I'm going to talk a little bit about Georgia Tech and Florida State as well. I actually picked that game correctly. I picked Georgia Tech to win. The ACC this year is going to be really interesting. You got new teams, 2 of them on the West Coast, 1 in Dallas, Texas. You have the rise of some power programs again. Florida State last year, obviously this year started out slow. Miami's looking to get back into it. Virginia Tech's trying to make a claim back to the top. You've got Clemson trying to stay relevant. And then you've also got a bunch of other teams that are looking to elevate themselves into a spot they've never been before. Georgia Tech, NC State, Syracuse has a chance to make a big play. Louisville can kind of become a mainstay in the ACC this year. So there's a lot of really good storylines, and there's a lot of good competition that's going to happen within the ACC itself. But before we start talking about those teams, I want to talk about the new teams, starting with the Stanford Cardinals. Troy Taylor, second year as head coach. He's got a big rebuild ahead of him. Great year 1 personnel movements with the roster. Not sure how much you're going to see that transfer into on-field production. You've got Elijah Brown and Ashton Daniels battling it out for the QB spot. You do have a pretty legit playmaker in Alik Ayumanor at wide receiver. There's a lot of concern with the offensive line. They gave up 41 sacks last year. They only averaged 3.5 yards per carry in the run game, which is one of the worst stats in the nation. And then defensively, it was a complete nightmare. They ranked 129th in total defense. But he is doing the right things, and he's adding the right pieces, and he's doing things at the right pace. And Stanford's on the right track. They're just going to have to give him time to get his vision through. It's going to be a long-term rebuild, but I do think Troy Taylor is a guy that can rebuild Stanford back into kind of their glory days, at least national competitiveness back when you saw with David Shaw and like Christian McCaffrey. The other West Coast team is California, and this is definitely a top 3 toughest job in the ACC, and it's one of the toughest jobs in Power 4. Justin Wilcox is doing a great job really dealing with all these challenges, but he's living and dying by the portal, and he might start being on the wrong end of that, on the dying end of that on the portal. He's struggling with high school recruiting, but that's going to get even harder as now he's trying to recruit West Coast kids to play over half their games on the East Coast, and now he's trying to get East Coast kids to come all the way out to a West Coast school that hasn't really had much going for him. It doesn't really have a great administrative backing. I do feel good about the QB room. They've either got Francisco Mendoza or Chandler Morris at QB. Both of those guys are going to be reliable. Mendoza kind of gave them a spark at offense they haven't had in Wilcox's entire tenure there. And they're going to have to build around Jaden Ott at running back. He is a great playmaker. They've got a lot of newcomers at wide receiver. They lose their best target in Jeremiah Hunter to Washington in the portal. And then defensively, Wilcox has usually led a pretty stout unit. However, they took a pretty big dip last year. If they can kind of get back to that Wilcox kind of defensive presence that they've had, and that offense continues to grow and rise the way it did last year, California could pull off a pretty surprising season, especially based off of where I think they're going to end up finishing currently in the preseason. They do, however, return Pac-12 Freshman Defensive Player of the Year Cade Ulave, so that's somebody for Wilcox to build around on the defensive side of the ball. The final newcomer for the ACC this year is SMU, the Mustangs. They were the reigning AAC champs, American Conference champs. You've got Rhett Lashley, a young star head coach, Preston Stone at QB, and their backup's good too. He led them to the AAC title game when Preston Stone got hurt. They've got a really young, exciting group of playmakers at running back, receiver, and tight end. I do have some worries about their offensive line. However, they are experienced. They're returning a lot of depth. So if you just see some improvement there, it could be a pretty good year for them. Defensively, I have some concerns as well on that defensive line. However, this was a top 15 unit in yards allowed. but playing a Power 4 schedule, even though they have an easier ACC schedule, you're still going against better size and better athleticism that you face in the G5, and that concerns me with their front seven depth especially. However, they do have an easier ACC schedule, and if that offense sparks like it did last year, they could find themselves in the ACC title game. You look at that early matchup, I think it's week 4, week 5 against Florida State at home, especially after what you just saw with Florida State in week 0. SMU really has things that has a path that could tilt their way and find themselves in Charlotte come December. So now I'm going to kind of break down the rest of the ACC in tiers. I think there's 3 tiers here, and there's a couple of teams that you could kind of put in each tier. I'm going to start with tier 3, and I have Stanford and California in tier 3 as well. The other 2 teams I have in tier 3 is UVA, Virginia Cavaliers. It's Tony Elliott's 3rd year here. Hasn't had a winning season yet. They've got to have some QB consistency. They have 2 good options in Anthony Colandrera and then Tony Muskett, but they have to be more consistent and they have to be more reliable at the QB spot. They do have a really experienced and veteran offensive line. That run game has to be better. They were 13th in the ACC last year in running yards per game. But they did hit some solid portal additions. They have Kobe Pace at running back, looking to use him in the run game better. They did have a pretty explosive passing game last year. They lose Malik Washington to the NFL, but they did address that in the portal and brought in a collection of guys to not try to individually replace his numbers, but to, as a group, collectively replace his numbers. And that's a really smart strategy, especially for a team in Virginia's spot. They had the worst scoring defense in the ACC. They were last in the ACC in sacks, and they were second to last in rushing yards allowed. That defense has to get better. They tried to retool it a little bit in the portal. They have a lot of youth. They had a lot of injuries as well last year on the defensive side of the ball. But no matter how good that offense is, if they have that same level of production or really lack of production, they're going to find themselves with a losing season again. One important thing to note is that they did have 5 single-digit losses last year, and 4 of those were by 3 points or less. You get a couple bounces of the ball that turn out a little bit differently. Virginia could be looking at a winning season. I certainly hope they do. Tony Elliott needs a good year here as his job's starting to heat up a little bit. And then Wake Forest is my last tier 3 team in the ACC. Dave Clawson's an amazing head coach. He's super underrated. Wake Forest is an incredibly tough spot to recruit at, develop talent at, and compete at. They don't have Sam Hartman anymore, and they don't have A.T. Perry, so they've got to establish a QB there. They've got a couple options, and they need a playmaker to break out. I'm kind of looking at Donovan Green as that potential option. He missed 2021 and 2023 with injuries, but if he can stay healthy, I think he could be a really reliable target to kind of help that offense find a rhythm again that they used to have with Hartman and Perry. That offensive line, it's got to get more consistent. Kind of a big theme here with some of these bottom tier teams. That offensive line has to be more reliable and consistent week in and week out. And then defensively, you've just got to continue to build. It's 2nd year under defensive coordinator Brad Lambert. They took some good strides. The stats don't really show it, but they did make improvements from the previous year to his year last year. They have some front 7 talent, starting with Jasheen Davis on the edge, Dylan Hazen at linebacker, and then Kevin Pointer at interior defensive line. That secondary needs some work, and that kicking game needs some work as well. But if anybody's going to do it at Wake Forest, it's going to be Dave Clawson. But they do have some big issues that they've got to work out and address. So moving on to Tier 2, I have SMU in the Tier 2. That's certainly a team that can elevate into Tier 1 potentially this year. Maybe a little bit more consistent competition in the ACC before they can do that. But they have a chance to make a run for the ACC title game. Duke is another Tier 2 team. They lose Mike Elko, but that was an amazing hire in Manny Diaz to not only replace him, but kind of build on continuity. You're going from one defensive mind to the next. Manny Diaz seems like the kind of guy that could stay at Duke for several years and build. He wasn't as bad as everybody made him out to be at Miami. He had a winning record when he was the head coach at Miami. He's a really good defensive mind. He's a really energetic coach. I think he's going to do good things for recruiting, and he's already making some big news in the transfer portal with Duke, and they just flipped a 4-star defensive lineman who had been a battle between Georgia and Clemson, and he had committed to Clemson, but they just flipped him. They have some potential at wide receiver. They're losing Jordan Waters at running back, so they've got to address some offensive production there. And the offensive line, they're replacing Graham Barden and one or two other starters that they're going to have to figure out, but that Graham Barden loss is going to be really big. They're losing their 4 starting defensive linemen and several guys in the secondary. They need better pass rush production, and then also some newcomers in that DB room to step up. However, they do return their top 3 tacklers, so there is a little bit of a foundation for Manny Diaz to work off of, and they're also losing Tyler Santucci as their defensive coordinator, and not to mention Mike Elko, who is a top 5 defensive mind in college football. A rival would do UNC, another Tier 2 team. No Drake May, no Tez Walker, and a new DC. They do keep Amarion Hampton at running back, which is huge. I don't know how much of that offensive line can be retooled to center and focus around a run game, but they're going to have to do it, as I don't really trust that passing game, especially early on in the season, as they also have just a lot of questions at pass catcher behind that loss of Tez Walker. And then new defensive coordinator Jeff Collins. He runs a kind of creative defensive scheme that uses a lot of exotic looks and blitzes. How is that going to fit with the new personnel they have here? They do have some solid edge and outside linebackers, but they don't have a great interior defensive line. There's a lot of questions there, at least. And they're also really young in the secondary. As that new scheme's kind of getting implemented, and then you have these offensive questions, I think it could shape up to be a rough start to the season. We'll see how Mac Brown kind of handles that early on. They have a pretty tough week 1 test against Minnesota. Syracuse, this is my pick for this year's Louisville, as they have a really favorable schedule. Their 4 toughest ACC games are Georgia Tech, NC State, Va Tech, and Miami, and all of those games except for NC State are home games, and that Miami game is the last game of the season for Syracuse. So they get some early wins and they stack up some wins. That Georgia Tech game looks a lot more tough than it did 2 weeks ago, but they get some early wins to stack up, build some momentum. This is certainly a team that could find themselves in Charlotte as well, just based off the schedule. But it's not just based off the schedule. Fran Brown was another great hire made by an ACC administration this offseason. He's already got some early personnel momentum with the transfer portal and recruiting, starting with Kyle McCord, and this is an offense that could potentially jump out at people. Kyle McCord's not an elite QB. I wouldn't even say he's a great QB, but he's better than what they've had. And you return some playmakers that were lost to injury last year, including Rondé Gadsden II, who is a massive target, and they added some more size in the receiving core as well. They could, with improved QB play and a favorable schedule, this is an offense that could look pretty solid statistically. And I don't expect them to have to win games by themselves either. I think this defense is going to be rejuvenated. They make a hire of Elijah Robinson from Texas A&M. They bring in Fadil Diggs, defensive end / edge. They have probably a top 3 ACC linebacker pair, maybe even top 2, right behind Clemson. And they have a borderline elite trio of safeties that they can kind of build that secondary around and build a foundation around. And so if this is a team that can get some early momentum going in the season, this is a team that we might be talking about deep into the ACC race in November and heading into the ACC championship. Speaking of this year's Louisville, let's talk about last year's Louisville, which was Louisville themselves. Jeff Brom, super underrated head coach. He gets a QB that's really going to fit his system in Tyler Show from Texas Tech. There's a lot of questions with their depth at wide receiver, and overall they're like top-tier talent, top-end talent at wide receiver. But they do have a really, really great tight end room that could carry this offense forward, at least in the passing game, and then pave the way for that run game too. They're going to have solid offensive line play, and then they have Maurice Turner and Donald Chaney at running back. That's going to kind of pave the way for that ground game, and they're gonna put that offense on their backs, and then hopefully open up some pass looks for maybe a less talented at the start of the season receiving core for Tyler Show and Jeff Brom to take advantage of. And then defensively, they were a defensive unit last year. That's what carried their team throughout the season. I don't really expect that to change. I think front seven has some concerns, especially in that second unit, but they can certainly develop that throughout the season. I think early on they're going to be pretty solid as well with their starting rotation at least, and then they're going to have a really good corner room. Their defensive coordinator has called it the best corner room he's ever coached, and they also returned their leading tackler on that defensive unit. So this is a team that is looking to kind of maintain that I don't have them at Tier 1 status, but some people do based off their appearance in the championship game last year. If they're able to make it back to Charlotte this year, I'd certainly have to move them up, and they're kind of a team looking to make that jump up into the Tier 1 status in the ACC. Pittsburgh is a team that made the ACC championship game a couple years ago and then fell off a little bit. Pat Narduzzi's trying to get it back on track. They've got to find a QB. They have not had a QB with Phil Jerkovich and Keaton Slovis. He's got some options. He's got Nate Yarnell, but he's also got sophomore from Alabama in the portal, Eli Holstein, a 4-star. And they've got to improve that offensive production and explosiveness, really. And to do that, he brought in offensive coordinator Cade Bell. He was the offensive coordinator last season at Western Carolina. He led the FCS in total yards per game with 505 yards per game on average. So super explosive scheme, lots of good passing concepts, lots of good running concepts. And he brings 2 former receivers from that Western Carolina team as well. And they also have Gavin Bartholomew at tight end. Defensively, they kind of fell off last year under Narduzzi. Narduzzi's kind of a defensive-minded guy, or he's at least had some really good defensive units, so they've got to get that back. And if they're able to get that back and then combine that with some offensive explosiveness, I don't expect this to be a team that's going to be in Charlotte. But that game, November 16th at home against Clemson, the week after they play Virginia Tech, that's the type of game that can make some noise in the ACC and potentially knock out an ACC contender or force an ACC contender to win the ACC championship in order to be able to make the playoffs. That could be a major playoff spoiler game right there. Virginia Tech, this is my ACC sleeper of the pick, or ACC sleeper pick for the year, and they've been very popular with that pick in recent years, or recent weeks and months. I was kind of on them a little bit earlier, but now everybody else is starting to pick up that steam with them. Kyron Jones, when he started last year, they averaged 220 rushing yards per game, top 5 to top 10 in the country. That's going to keep up. This is the best receiving group that they've had at Virginia Tech with his new Rejon. This is year 3 now for him. And if that offensive line hits and Kyron Jones develops as a passer, it's going to be one of the most complete offenses in the country. They'll probably be top 10 in the country in points per game. But even if that offensive line doesn't hit, it's going to be a pretty reliable run game. They're just not going to be able to be explosive as they want, and that sleeper pick might fail. Defensively, though, they are going to be pretty talented. They were top 20 last year after some early struggles. They're returning a lot of key contributors in that secondary. Their pass defense is going to be pretty good this year. And then they poured in a lot of help on that front 7 to fix that run D. And then they have some game changers on special teams, especially in the return game. And then my last Tier 2 team is Georgia Tech, and they just made a big move, beating a team that I have in my Tier 1 in Week 0 here. And I picked Georgia Tech to win because I saw this pieces coming back, especially on the offensive side of the ball. You have Haynes King, who I think is a super underrated quarterback. You have Jamal Haynes, a 1,000-yard rusher at running back. You have your top 2 wide receivers and your tight end back, and you have 4 out of your 5 starting offensive linemen returning. Defensively, they were very poor last year. They hired Tyler Santucci, the defensive coordinator from Duke last season, to come in and fix it, and he did an incredible job. But that whole game plan just made perfect sense. They just kept the ball out of Florida State's hands, and if they're able to do that every single game, they're going to be able to compete in every single game. I don't know if they'll be able to win every single game, especially in that last stretch of the season. They have probably one of the toughest 5-game stretches at the end of the season, right up there with Florida's. But this is certainly a team that's going to be able to compete in all of those games. And the way that defense played, they gave up 3 scoring drives on 7 possessions for Florida State. They tackled well. They rushed the passer well. They had an amazing run defense. They only gave up, I believe, 98 rushing yards. And that's amazing considering last year they led the ACC in rushing offense, but were the worst in the ACC in rushing defense. So if they're able to keep that trend up, Georgia Tech is a major sleeper, maybe a year earlier than I thought they were going to be. But they're doing all the right things there. They're recruiting Atlanta well. They're starting to pick up some momentum in high school recruiting as well. And this is a program that could kind of elevate themselves into a national powerhouse if the cards keep falling right for them and they keep doing what they're doing. And then finally, for my Tier 1, I'm going to start with Florida State here. I did pick Georgia Tech to win. I still think Florida State's a Tier 1 ACC program, although if it goes as bad as it could this season based off of what they looked like Week 0, I thought they looked way worse than I thought they were going to be. They could kind of fall back down to that tier 2 status. They don't recruit, or they haven't recruited high school at an elite level, and they've been trying to band-aid their roster with the portal, and last season it worked because they got some really impact players, some really important impact players out of the portal. This year there wasn't as many to pull from, and that starts at QB. DJ Uiagalelei is not Jordan Travis. He's not an elevator of talent around him, and Florida State needs that this year more than they ever have. They lose Keon Coleman, they lose Jaheim Bell, they lose Johnny Wilson, they lose Trey Benson, a 1,000-yard rusher, they lose starters on the offensive line, they lose some key contributors on that defense in the secondary and on the defensive line, including Braden Fisk and Jared Verse, who was a stud pass rusher. So they just lost a ton of production, and I personally didn't think they were going to be able to fill that production, especially this early in the season. I have Florida State going about 8-4 this year. I think their floor is a losing season. I think their ceiling was probably like 10-2. Based off of that week 0 performance, I think that's a little high. I think it's more realistic for them to go 7-5, 8-4 right now for sure. Although it is week 0 and there's a lot of change that can be made, but they don't have any explosiveness on offense, and I don't see that changing with DJ at quarterback, as he's not able to elevate talent down the field with a passing attack, and they can't keep relying on screens and little hitch routes. In the first half, he averaged negative 0.1 air yards per attempt, and that's not going to win them any games, especially against tough teams. They play SMU in a couple weeks. They have Boston College in week 1, and I don't think that's a light game as well. As Boston College, I actually forgot to talk about them. They're a tier 2 team. They have Bill O'Brien at head coach and Thomas Castellanos, who was an 1,100-yard rusher as a QB. They're going to play a really blue-collar game in that, and if they're not able to match that physicality that Boston College might be presenting, that could end up being another loss for them, although that would certainly be mind-blowing if they lose that game. But they've got a tough schedule. They have Clemson still, they have Miami, they have Florida, they have Notre Dame. This season could get really out of hand for Mike Norvell if they don't get that physicality back up and figure out how to attack down the field in the passing game. I'm going to go back to Tier 2 as I did skip over Boston College. Kind of already mentioned, though, Thomas Castellanos and Bill O'Brien. I think that's going to be a really good head coach QB pair. I think he could do a lot of good things for this team. They have some potential playmakers that could break out at running back and receiver. Defensively, they've got to get better, but I think they're really going to embrace that blue-collar approach, and I think this is a team that is going to play some good football and compete to make a bowl game and kind of build off of the success that Jeff Hafley could never fully capitalize on, and I think Bill O'Brien will end up embracing that kind of culture at Boston College, and he could potentially make them into a pretty solid ACC team where they could contend for an ACC title every couple of years. But I'm excited to see what they're going to do, especially with Thomas Castellanos returning this year. So now back to Tier 1. Let's go to NC State. This is a team that I struggled with. I kind of thought they fit Tier 2 more, but I think they're going to play like a Tier 1 team this year, especially late in the season. They have 2 early tests, one non-conference against Tennessee, and then one road game against Clemson. I don't think they're going to win either of those games. But after that, they just have to get through and just improve defensively. And that's not really what you expect to hear from an NC State team, as their defense has been a stalwart the past couple of years. Tony Gibson is one of the best defensive coordinators in the country. But they're replacing Peyton Wilson, and they're replacing a ton of production at the defensive line and also in the secondary. They're going to have a completely new trio at linebacker. And then after Aiden White at corner and in the DB room in general, they've got a lot of youth coming in, but they do have an offensive unit that I think is poised to break out even more than they did at the end of last year. It's Robert and I's second year here. They look really explosive down the stretch. They have Grayson McCall at QB. They have Kevin Concepcion, who was the ACC Rookie of the Year, along with a 5-star from the portal that they pulled in, Noah Rogers. I think offensive line is going to be good. They get Jordan Waters from Duke, who's a really solid running back. And they're punter U, and I think they're going to continue that trend. They're going to have good special teams play, and it's time for Dave Doeren to really break out. And he's never had a 10-win season. I certainly think they can. I think this is probably their best year to do it. They've got a couple of early tests. If they go 1-1 in those games, I certainly think they're going to have a 10-win season. But even if they drop both of them, this is their year to do it. And If they lose both of those games, they're going to have a hard time sneaking into the playoffs. But if they drop Clemson and win out in the ACC, they could find themselves in Charlotte with a chance to clinch a spot in it. Now I'm going to talk about Miami. I think Miami is kind of that classic team that gets hyped up along with A&M every year, then they end up not doing anything. Well, this is Mario Cristobal's third year here, and I think they're following that Texas trend perfectly. They go 5-7 just like Texas did in year one. They went 8 games last year. I think people thought they were going to be better. I thought they were going to be better than they were last year, but I think they're going to be extremely good this year. I think they're going to make the playoffs, and I think they're going to make the ACC title game. I think Cam Ward is the best quarterback in the country. Not best senior quarterback, not best upperclassman quarterback, just the best quarterback in the country, period. I think Damian Martinez is an absolutely fantastic addition in that running back room. They need somebody to break out a receiver. I think Xavier Restrepo could certainly do that as they lose Colby Young. They are replacing their safety duo, which was a pretty elite duo there, but they have a really good cornerback room. They have Francisco Malioga at linebacker, and then they have Ruben Bain, who is an absolute stud. He's a true sophomore pass rusher. And then this year they just have to put the pieces together. They have a really solid offensive line anchored by their tackle tandem. They just have to put the pieces together, and Mario Cristobal has to prove that he can do it. They made some big-time errors last year, game management-wise, most notably that Georgia Tech game. But, man, Mario Cristobal won a Rose Bowl at Oregon. I think he can win the big game. I don't really think he's been in position to win the big game, and I think this team is really young, and that could come back to bite them. But they have a lot of playmakers on this roster on offense and defense, and I think when you have somebody like Cam Ward, when you get into a close game, I think he's the type of player that can elevate that team and lift them to a victory. I think you're going to see Miami in the ACC championship game. The last team I'm going to talk about here is Clemson before I make my conference championship prediction. Clemson is kind of like the epitome of culture in the ACC and really in the nation. They don't use the transfer portal. They have kind of started to embrace a lower key recruiting approach. They still go out and get top guys, but they've kind of embraced a talent evaluation and development approach. And last year it paid off big time as their freshman class came up huge for them. I think you're going to have to see their freshman class this year come up huge, especially early on, as I'm going to talk about in a minute. But this just comes down to Cade Klubnik, man. How good can he be? You got Phil Moffitt running back. He's a great running back. I think he's a better runner of the football than Will Shipley was. And you're going to have an improved passing game. You got Jake Brenningstool at tight end. You've got Adam Randall at receiver, who I think is poised for a breakout. But even if he doesn't break out, you have Antonio Williams. You have Tyler Brown. You have TJ Moore coming in as a true freshman. You have Bryant Wesco coming in as a true freshman. You have Troy Stellato. So you have this passing game that has some legitimate, not only talent, but diversification of talent too, which is something Clemson has not had, including speed. Speed is a big one. And at that passing game, those receivers can kind of click along with Jake Brenningstool. Cade Klubnik's just got to be able to hit him and manage the game. And I think he's going to be capable of doing that as Garrett Riley year 2. I think you're going to see a little bit more of explosiveness in that Clemson offense. And then I think Matt Luke is going to be able to do enough with the offensive line to where it's not going to lose Clemson games anymore. Defensively, that defensive line is going to be gross, especially off the edge. Peter Woods is moving to the edge as a 320-pound pass rusher. And then they have TJ Parker as well. The interior defensive line doesn't really have any big names, but they have some guys that are going to be able to contribute early on. Devontae Capart's one of them, and he's going to be an integral piece of that Clemson defense, especially in Week 1 against Georgia. The secondary has some early injury concerns, but they do have a lot of talent there. If those injury concerns kind of heal up, that secondary is going to be one of the best in the country. It's definitely going to be one of the best in the ACC, led by Avion Terrell. But you also have R.J. Mickens, you have Sheldon Lewis, you have Khalil Barnes, who also is going to shadow a little bit of linebacker. A name there to watch is Ashton Hampton. He's a 3-star, but out of camp he's been getting rave reviews, and he's probably going to make his presence felt one way or the other in the Georgia games. He's going to get on the field due to injuries. But that linebacking core, I think, is what's going to really be the glue to that defense. I think is the best linebacking core in the country. Barrett Carter, you have Wade Woodass, Khalil Barnes, like I said, is going to play a little bit at linebacker. You have some guys who kind of broke out towards the end of last year. something Jamal. And then you have Sammy Brown, the true freshman 5-star linebacker, who is going to be a stud at the college level and probably at the NFL level as well. But special teams has to improve, especially the kicking game. Clemson lost their 4 games last year off of like 10, 12 plays, and one of them was a field goal. They kicked a field goal, a 40-yarder, and they beat Florida State. And then turnovers, and then the turnovers are the other handful of those plays. They had multiple goal line turnovers, and turnovers is kind of an advent of decision making. Cade Klubnik's got to be a better decision maker with the football. So I already said Miami was going to be in the ACC Championship. I think Clemson's going to face them in the ACC Championship, and I think Clemson's going to win the ACC Championship to clinch their berth into the first year of the 12-team playoffs. I think it's going to be a really exciting year. I think there's a lot of great stories and players to watch, some new faces, players and coaching-wise and team-wise. And I'm really excited to watch the ACC this year play football. We're going to have all the conference previews come out later in the week with playoff predictions as well. And then week 1 picks. Thank y'all for watching.